He thought he had bought his dream home, but when he found a secret door on his property and went inside, he realized it was the worst mistake of his life. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. Daniel Hayes had never believed he would find the courage to abandon the city. For more than a decade, he had lived among its restless traffic, neon signs, and suffocating cubicles that smelled of burnt coffee and stale ambition. Day after day, he had taken the same route to work, stared at the same gray walls of the office, and returned at night to a rented apartment where the walls seemed to absorb and echo every sound from the neighbors. The stress had become a part of him, carving lines into his face long before their time, and he often caught himself wondering if this was what life had in store for him forever. But after his father's death, something shifted inside him. The older man had worked until his last breath, saving and sacrificing, only to leave the world without having lived the way he wanted. That realization pushed Daniel to reconsider everything. He sold the little he owned in the city, gave notice at his job, and started searching for something different, something quieter. The advertisement had seemed almost too good to be true. An old wooden house with a stone foundation, nestled in 16 hectares of land that included a thick forest, a sloping meadow, and a natural lake. The price was surprisingly low for such a generous portion of countryside, but Daniel didn't allow himself to dwell on the reasons why. Perhaps the owner needed the money urgently. Perhaps it was simply luck. He convinced himself that it was fate. He signed the papers, and within weeks he was standing on the front porch of his new home, breathing in the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. The air felt cleaner here, unspoiled, and every inhale seemed to reach deeper into his lungs than it ever had in the city. At first, the house felt ancient and unfamiliar. The wooden floors creaked beneath his weight, the windows rattled with each gust of wind, and sometimes the walls moaned with the sound of settling beams. But Daniel found charm in those imperfections. He filled the rooms with his modest belongings, unpacked boxes of books, hung pictures of his parents, and carefully set his father's old clock on the mantel. Each day he discovered something new about the property. The wildflowers that colored the meadow in the morning sun, the deer that moved silently between the trees, and the slow way the fog rolled off the lake at dawn. He spent hours walking barefoot through the grass, savoring the sensation of earth beneath his feet, the kind of contact he had never known while rushing down concrete sidewalks. The townsfolk were polite when he introduced himself at the local store, though he noticed something in their expressions whenever he mentioned the lake. It was subtle, a flicker of hesitation, a shadow in their eyes, but Daniel did not press. They welcomed him with cautious curiosity, a stranger from the city who had chosen to bury himself in solitude. An older man at the counter, his hands rough from years of labor, made a passing remark that lingered in Daniel's mind longer than it should have. "That lake of yours," the man muttered, "it's got stories. Best not to go poking around there." He said it with the casual tone of someone mentioning the weather, yet his gaze was sharp, as if measuring Daniel's reaction. Daniel chuckled politely, brushing it off as a local superstition, the kind of folklore small communities cling to in order to keep the past alive. But when he returned home that evening, the remark replayed in his head. He stood on his porch, staring across the meadow toward the line of trees that concealed the water. The air grew cooler as the sun set, and for a moment he wondered if there really was something about the lake that he should fear. The following day he could not resist the pull of curiosity. He set out toward the water, pushing through the trees until the forest opened into a clearing. The lake stretched before him, its surface still and smooth as glass, reflecting the pale sky above. The silence here was unlike the silence of the woods. It was heavier, more complete, as if the lake absorbed sound instead of carrying it. Daniel crouched near the edge, skimming his hand over the cool surface. It seemed ordinary, serene even, but something in the stillness unsettled him. As he walked along the bank, he noticed something odd among the weeds and moss. A circle of stones jutted from the earth, arranged too precisely to be natural. Their surfaces were darkened with age, their edges softened by years of exposure, but their alignment was deliberate. Daniel knelt to examine them more closely. The soil around them had sunken slightly, creating a shallow depression, and as he leaned forward, he felt the faintest breath of air escaping through a crack between the stones. It was cool against his skin, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and earth. He frowned, brushing dirt from the surface with his hands. The stones felt ancient, weathered by time, yet their purpose was unclear. Perhaps they were remnants of an old well, he thought, or maybe some kind of drainage structure. The idea of hidden history excited him. There was something thrilling about discovering traces of those who had come before. Yet a thread of unease coiled in his stomach. If this was just a well, why had it been covered so thoroughly, concealed beneath soil and moss as if deliberately forgotten? He stood and gazed across the still surface of the lake, wondering how many secrets lay buried beneath this land. The wind stirred through the trees behind him, and for the first time since moving here, Daniel felt something that was not peace. It was not quite fear, not yet, but it was close enough to tighten his chest. He brushed the dirt from his hands, forcing himself to laugh at his own imagination, and began the walk back to the house. That night, however, sleep eluded him. He lay in bed, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old house, the steady ticking of his father's clock in the living room. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the circle of stones by the lake, the dark gap between them where the air had whispered against his skin. The image refused to fade, lingering like a shadow just beyond reach. He rolled onto his side, pressing his face into the pillow, and told himself that it was nothing more than the natural curiosity of a man adjusting to a new home. Yet, deep down, beneath the logic, a question remained, echoing softly like the murmur of water. What lay beneath those stones? And though he would not admit it to himself, Daniel knew he would not be able to leave it alone for long. The following morning, Daniel rose earlier than usual, his mind already restless with the thought of what he had seen near the lake. He brewed himself a pot of coffee, sipped it slowly at the wooden table in his kitchen, and stared out the window at the tree line that concealed the water. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that the stones were nothing more than remnants of some mundane structure, curiosity gnawed at him with a steady persistence. He knew that if he didn't return to investigate, the image of that sunken circle and the faint current of air that had touched his skin would haunt him. By the time the last of his coffee had cooled, he had already made up his mind. The walk to the lake felt different now. The first time he had come here, he had been guided by idle curiosity, with no real expectation of discovery. Today, he felt a subtle pressure in his chest, as if the trees themselves were watching his progress. The forest was still in the early light, its silence broken only by the occasional call of a bird. Yet even those sounds seemed muted, distant. When he stepped into the clearing, the lake lay before him in the same placid calm as before, but now it seemed to wait for him, as though it had been expecting his return. He moved straight to the circle of stones, kneeling once again to examine them. His fingers traced the rough surfaces, following the lines where the earth had begun to swallow them. The memory of that cool draft of air rose vividly in his mind, and as he pressed his hand against the largest stone, he felt it again. A faint breath, impossible to mistake. The notion that something beneath the ground still breathed unsettled him, but it also quickened his pulse with excitement. Daniel glanced back toward the house, though it was hidden behind the thick stand of trees. He knew no one was around to see him. The thought emboldened him. He wiped his palms against his jeans, planted his feet firmly in the soil, and began pushing at one of the stones. It resisted at first, solid and unyielding, but as he shifted his weight and pressed harder, it began to move with a reluctant scrape of stone against earth. Moss flaked away, dirt crumbled down, and slowly the stone tilted enough to reveal the dark gap beneath it. The air that rushed out this time was colder, sharper, and carried a distinct odor of damp stone and earth that had not seen daylight in years. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He crouched closer, peering into the blackness below. At first, all he could see was shadow, but when he angled his head, he glimpsed the edge of a structure, stone steps descending into the ground. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment he considered abandoning the effort entirely. He could just cover the stones again, tell himself it was nothing, and go on with his new life as if the circle had never existed. But he knew he wouldn't. The mystery was already too deep inside him, urging him forward. He pushed aside more stones, widening the gap until it was large enough for him to slip through. The entrance yawned at him, dark and uninviting, but the sight of the steps cut into the earth stirred something almost childlike inside him. It felt like discovering the entrance to another world, a hidden place kept secret for generations. He retrieved the flashlight he had brought from the house, its beam slicing through the shadows. The light revealed rough-hewn walls, damp with moisture, and the first few steps leading downward. Daniel hesitated, his hand tightening around the flashlight. A sensible part of his mind urged caution. He had no idea how stable the structure was, or what dangers might lie below, yet the urge to know outweighed his hesitation. He crouched, swung his legs through the opening, and carefully set his feet on the steps. The stone was slick with condensation, cold against his soles. He gripped the edge of the opening for balance, then slowly released it, committing himself to the descent. Each step carried him deeper into the earth. The walls pressed close on either side, their surfaces rough and damp beneath his fingertips. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above, echoing in the narrow passage. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly with the rhythm of his breath, illuminating patches of moss clinging stubbornly to the stone. His foot slipped once, sending a jolt of panic through him, but he caught himself quickly, pressing his shoulder against the wall until his heartbeat steadied. The air grew cooler as he descended, heavy with the scent of minerals and age. He paused midway down the steps, lifting the flashlight to study the walls more closely. Carved into the stone were faint scratches, too irregular to be markings but too deliberate to be accidents. He brushed his hand over them, wondering if they had been left by the tools of whoever had constructed this passage. The idea that someone had once labored here, chiseling these stones into shape, deepened the sense of history pressing down on him. At the bottom of the steps, the passage leveled out into a narrow corridor. The ceiling arched just above his head, forcing him to stoop slightly as he moved forward. His footsteps echoed with an eerie clarity, bouncing off the stone and carrying far ahead of him. He slowed, listening, but heard nothing in return beyond the steady drip of water. The silence here was profound, thicker even than the silence at the lake, and it weighed on him with a subtle pressure. The corridor stretched forward, its walls lined with more patches of moss and streaks of mineral deposits left by trickling water. As he advanced, he noticed small remnants scattered along the floor: a rusted nail, the splintered fragment of a wooden plank, a length of corroded chain. He crouched to examine them, turning one piece of metal over in his hand. It was pitted and fragile, as though it had been lying here for a century. The discovery confirmed what he had already suspected. This was no natural formation. People had once used this passage, and they had left traces behind. The flashlight beam swept ahead, and Daniel froze. A faint glimmer caught his eye, a reflection of light far down the corridor. At first, he thought it was nothing more than water catching the beam, but as he took a cautious step closer, the sound reached him, a muted, rhythmic plop, as though water was falling into water. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. The memory of the lake above returned to him, and he realized the passage must lead toward it. But what could be down here beneath the earth, where no light reached and no one had walked for decades? He forced himself onward, each step louder in his own ears, the sound of water growing steadily closer. The corridor widened slightly, the ceiling lifting just enough for him to straighten his back. The air grew colder still, brushing against his face with each movement. He shivered, adjusting the grip on his flashlight. When the passage curved, the faint glimmer grew stronger, and Daniel realized the light was reflecting off a body of water. His pulse quickened, anticipation mingled with unease. He rounded the bend and found himself staring into a shadowed expanse that stretched further than the beam of his flashlight could reach. The sound of water dripping into the surface echoed through the chamber, magnified by the stone walls. The corridor had led him into something larger, something hidden beneath his land. Daniel took a step closer, his breath fogging in the chill. The stones beneath his feet were slick with moisture, and he steadied himself with one hand against the wall. He raised the flashlight, its beam skimming across the surface of what appeared to be a pool or perhaps the edge of a subterranean lake. The water was dark, opaque, but scattered across its edges lay debris that caught the light. Rusted tools, fragments of wood, and something else. Something metallic glinting faintly beneath a film of algae. He crouched at the edge, the hairs on his arms rising despite the cold. He wanted to reach out, to touch the objects, to know what they were, but some instinct held him back. This was more than just an abandoned structure. It was the gateway to a secret long buried. The circle of stones on the surface had not been placed there to mark a simple well. They had been built to conceal this place, to keep it hidden. As Daniel straightened, his flashlight beam swept once more across the chamber, and he felt the weight of the silence pressing against him. It was as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting. His own breath came shallow and quick. He knew he had crossed a line by coming here, that he could no longer return to his life of peaceful walks and quiet evenings by the fire. The hidden passage had revealed itself, and with it came questions he could not ignore. The sound of water echoed again, louder this time, though he could not tell whether it was from his own movements or something deeper in the chamber. He gripped the flashlight tighter, fighting the sudden urge to retreat back up the steps and seal the entrance once more. But he did not. He could not. The mystery demanded more of him, and though unease curled tighter around his chest, he pushed forward, edging closer to the unseen depths of the underground lake. And there, With the cold breath of the subterranean air on his face and the darkness stretching endlessly before him, Daniel realized that his new life had already begun to twist into something he had not anticipated. Daniel remained at the edge of the corridor, staring into the chamber with his breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. The sound of water was stronger here, magnified by the stone walls until it seemed to reverberate through his entire body. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the space again, revealing more of what lay ahead. The floor of the chamber sloped gently downward, leading to the dark surface of an underground lake. The water shimmered faintly, where droplets from the ceiling struck its surface, rippling outward in widening rings that vanished into the shadows. The sight was mesmerizing in its stillness, yet also unsettling. This was not the kind of place that invited comfort. The air smelled of minerals, heavy and metallic, and carried with it the damp chill of deep earth. Daniel took a tentative step forward, the soles of his boots skidding slightly on the slick stone. His flashlight caught on something at the water's edge, and he lowered the beam to see more clearly. There, half submerged in the mud and algae, lay the unmistakable remnants of a wooden beam, rotted nearly to nothing. Beside it, a corroded length of chain curled across the ground like the shed skin of some ancient creature. His heart thudded as he crouched to examine the objects. He reached out cautiously, brushing the surface of the chain with his fingers. It disintegrated almost instantly at his touch, crumbling into fragments of orange-brown rust that clung to his skin. Daniel wiped his hand against his jeans, his breath quickening. There was no mistaking it now. This place had once been used by people. Whoever had constructed the passage and descended these steps had also left behind their tools, their supports, and their traces. But why had they abandoned it? And why had they sealed the entrance with that stone circle, hidden away by years of earth and moss? He rose slowly and swept the light across the water again. For a moment, he thought he saw something glimmer beneath the surface, but the rippling of the water distorted the image before he could focus. Perhaps it was only a trick of the light, or perhaps there were more remnants beneath the depths. The idea both thrilled and unnerved him. He imagined crates sinking into the water, tools slipping from hands, entire operations swallowed whole by the underground lake. It was easy to picture men working here by the glow of lanterns, their voices echoing off the stone, their hammers ringing against rock. But now all that remained was silence, broken only by the steady drip of water from the ceiling. Daniel moved closer to the lake, careful with his footing. The air grew colder as he approached, his breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. At the water's edge, he crouched again and let the light play across the surface. What he saw then froze him in place. Scattered just beneath the thin film of algae were shapes, metallic, angular, and distinctly unnatural. Some looked like the remnants of tools, others like pieces of machinery. And then, just at the edge of the beam, he spotted the corner of what could only be a wooden crate, its planks warped and broken, but still intact enough to hold its shape. The sight sent a shiver racing down his spine. The crate was not empty. Inside, faint glints of metal reflected the flashlight, though the water distorted them beyond recognition. He wanted to reach for it, to drag it from the muck, but instinct warned him against it. The lake was deeper than it appeared, and one wrong move could pull him into its icy grip. He leaned back on his heels, trying to steady his thoughts. It was enough, for now, to know that the crate existed. Still, questions burned in his mind. Why was it left here? What had the people who built this place been doing? And what had happened that forced them to leave everything behind? He thought of the villagers, of the old man in the store who had warned him about the lake. Perhaps the stories were not mere superstition. Perhaps the townsfolk knew fragments of a history that Daniel was only now beginning to uncover. The flashlight beam slid across the far wall of the chamber, and Daniel's eyes widened. The stone there was not bare. Wooden supports jutted outward at uneven angles, remnants of a structure that had once extended into the lake. A platform, perhaps, or a dock. Most of it had collapsed, leaving only jagged beams and scattered debris. But the presence of such construction made one thing clear. This place had been more than a simple storage area or drainage system. It had been a site of deliberate activity, built and used for a purpose long forgotten. Daniel's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of evidence. The chain, the crate, the beams, all of it spoke of industry, of effort and intention. Yet the silence of the place was absolute, as if it had been abandoned in haste. He tried to imagine the workers who had once labored here, their faces lit by lanterns, their bodies bent under the weight of crates and tools. He wondered what had driven them to leave so suddenly, and whether any trace of their fate remained hidden in the shadows. As he stood at the water's edge, the beam of his flashlight flickered, its light stuttering across the chamber. Daniel cursed under his breath, tapping the casing until the beam steadied. He had brought spare batteries, but the sudden flicker unsettled him. He glanced once more at the crate in the water, then stepped back, retreating toward the corridor. His curiosity urged him to stay, to dig deeper, to wade into the lake and uncover the secrets it concealed. But another voice inside him whispered caution, a voice that grew louder with every passing moment in the underground hall. He stopped at the threshold of the corridor and turned back one last time. The underground lake lay in silence, its surface unbroken, its secrets hidden beneath the dark water. The sound of dripping echoed steadily, like the ticking of some ancient clock. Daniel's chest tightened with unease. He knew this was only the beginning, that what he had found so far was merely the first layer of a deeper mystery. And though he told himself he could walk away, that he could cover the entrance and forget what he had seen, he also knew it was a lie. The image of the crate, the glint of metal inside, the remnants of the platform, they would not leave him. When he finally turned and began the climb back up the corridor, the silence of the hall followed him, clinging to him like a shadow. The narrow passage felt even tighter now, the walls pressing in on either side, the ceiling lower than before. His footsteps echoed with unnatural clarity, as though the chamber behind him was reluctant to let him go. At the base of the steps, he paused and cast one last glance into the darkness. The faint shimmer of the lake was barely visible now, swallowed quickly by shadow. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight and began the climb. Each step upward was heavy, as though the earth itself resisted his departure. When he finally emerged into the daylight, he gasped for air, filling his lungs with the scent of pine and open sky. The contrast was overwhelming, the bright, living world above against the cold, silent depths below. He stood for a long moment, staring at the circle of stones he had displaced. They seemed smaller now, less impressive, but also more ominous. They were not just remnants of the past. They were guardians, placed deliberately to conceal the entrance, to ensure that what lay beneath remained forgotten. Yet Daniel had uncovered them. He had gone down into the darkness and returned with more questions than answers, and though the sight of the sunlit meadow brought him comfort, he could not shake the knowledge of what lay beneath his feet. That night, as he lay in bed, the image of the underground lake returned again and again, pulling him into restless dreams. He dreamed of water rising, of beams collapsing, of crates splitting open to reveal their contents. He dreamed of voices echoing through the chamber, voices he could not understand, but which filled him with dread. When morning came, he awoke with a chill clinging to his skin, though the fire in the hearth had burned all night. He knew then that he could not ignore the underground lake. It was not simply a curiosity. It was a puzzle that demanded to be solved, a mystery that would not release him until he found the truth. And so, despite the unease that had taken root in his heart, Daniel resolved to return. Daniel spent the better part of the morning pacing his kitchen, his mind locked on the images from the underground hall. No matter how hard he tried to distract himself with small tasks, brewing coffee, tidying the living room, even chopping firewood, the vision of the lake below returned with relentless persistence. He saw the broken beams jutting from the walls, the corroded chain that had crumbled at his touch, and most of all the half-sunken crate with its faint glint of metal hidden inside. He had thought a night's sleep would calm him, that distance from the darkness would restore perspective. But instead, the mystery gnawed at him all the more. By midday, he could no longer bear the restlessness. He gathered his courage and returned to the clearing, his boots crunching through the underbrush as he approached the circle of stones. They seemed somehow different now, less like ancient guardians and more like a broken seal, a warning he had already violated. Yet Daniel pressed on, kneeling to widen the opening he had created the day before. The cool breath of subterranean air greeted him again, damp and metallic, and he shivered as he lowered himself onto the stone steps. The descent was no easier this time. Each step creaked beneath his weight, as if the earth groaned at his intrusion, but he forced himself downward until the corridor opened into the underground hall. The sight of the lake struck him with the same force as before. Its surface lay in dark silence, punctuated by the rhythmic plop of droplets falling from the ceiling. The broken beams still clung stubbornly to the walls, and the crate in the water had not shifted. For a long moment, Daniel simply stood at the edge, his flashlight beam skimming across the chamber. Then, with a deep breath, he crouched again near the spot where he had first found the remnants of chain and wood. This time he dug with his hands into the mud, prying at the fragments until something solid came free. What he unearthed was a rusted iron tool, so corroded it hardly retained its shape. It might once have been a hammer or a pickaxe, though the handle was long gone and the metal was eaten through by years of damp. Still, the object carried weight in his palm, heavy not just with iron but with the certainty of human presence. He set it aside and continued to dig. Soon he uncovered more fragments. A splinter of rotted wood, the edge of a barrel stave, a shard of glass dulled by time. Each piece seemed a whisper of lives lived here, men who had bent their backs in this chamber, laboring by lantern light, only to vanish and leave their tools behind. It was while turning over a particularly large plank that he discovered something unexpected. Pressed between two layers of wood, protected from the worst of the damp, lay a scrap of paper. Daniel's breath caught as he carefully peeled it free, half expecting it to dissolve in his hands. Miraculously, though stained and brittle, the page still held traces of ink. He raised the flashlight, angling it to read the faded markings. Most of the text had bled away into illegibility, but in the corner he could make out a date, 1894. The numbers struck him with a peculiar force. This was not some distant medieval ruin, not a place of nameless antiquity. Barely more than a century ago, people had been here, working, writing, recording. He traced the ink with his finger, his heart thudding at the thought. He had uncovered a direct line to the past, a fragment of the lives of those who had built this place. And yet the page offered no explanation, no names, no purpose, only a year and the faint outline of letters lost to time. Daniel folded the scrap carefully and slipped it into his pocket, then sat back on his heels. He needed answers. The villagers might know more, though whether they would share that knowledge was another matter. He remembered the wary looks, the warning from the old man in the store. They had treated him politely, but when he had mentioned the lake, their eyes had darkened. Perhaps they knew pieces of the story, passed down as rumor or cautionary tale. Perhaps they had chosen silence for a reason. Still, Daniel felt he had to try. That afternoon, he drove into the village, the paper burning like a secret against his leg. The small streets were quiet, lined with houses whose shutters rattled in the wind. He parked near the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. A few heads turned, offering nods of greeting, but when he asked about the history of the land, their warmth cooled. Yes, there were mines in these hills, an elderly woman said, her eyes fixed on the floor as she arranged cans on a shelf. Back when the century was new, gold, silver, maybe copper. Men came from all around, thinking they'd find fortune. Some did, for a time. But what about the lake? Daniel pressed. Was there ever a mine near it? Her hands stilled, and for a moment the only sound was the hum of the store's old refrigerator. Finally, she shook her head. Don't know much about that. Folks said there were places best left alone. The earth has its secrets. Sometimes it swallows what it wants to keep. Another man, sitting near the counter, cleared his throat. He was the same old fellow who had spoken to Daniel before, his hands scarred with years of work. You'd do well not to poke around there, son. Whatever was done by that lake, it ended for a reason. People walked away, and they didn't go back. That ought to tell you enough. Daniel opened his mouth to ask more, but the man's gaze silenced him. It was not anger in those eyes, but something heavier, a kind of weariness born from knowing more than one wished to share. He thanked them both and left the store, though the lack of answers gnawed at him worse than before. That night, he could not shake the image of the paper in his pocket, the date staring at him like an accusation. His dreams were restless, filled with visions of men trudging into the earth, lanterns swaying, their faces blurred by shadow. He saw crates sinking into dark water, tools dropped in haste, and always the sound of footsteps retreating, as if from something they dared not face. In the morning, he resolved to return once more. This time he packed more deliberately, a coil of rope, fresh batteries for the flashlight, and a sturdy pair of gloves. If the villagers would not tell him the truth, he would have to find it himself. He told himself it was the instinct of a man who wanted to understand his land, who wanted to know the history beneath his feet. But beneath that rationalization lay something darker, a growing obsession that pulled at him like the gravity of the lake itself. As he made his way back through the forest, the trees seemed closer together, their branches knitting above him to block the sky. The clearing felt colder than before, the stones of the circle more severe in their arrangement. Daniel crouched, adjusted his pack, and slipped once more into the earth. The chamber welcomed him with the same silence, but now he looked at it with new eyes. Each fragment of wood, each corroded nail, each glimmer beneath the surface of the water was part of a story he had not yet pieced together. And though fear lingered at the edges of his mind, it was outweighed by the hunger to know. When he crouched again by the water, his light fell upon another crate, this one nearer the shore. His pulse quickened as he realized he might be able to drag it free with the rope. He tied a knot, threw the line around the warped wood, and pulled with all his strength. The crate shifted reluctantly, rising from the muck with a sickening squelch. Water poured from its seams as he dragged it onto the shore, the wood groaning under its own weight. Inside, beneath the broken planks, lay a tangle of rusted tools and scraps of fabric, the remnants of work long abandoned. And there, at the very bottom, beneath layers of silt, was another piece of paper, soaked but still legible enough to reveal faint black letters. Daniel's hands trembled as he lifted it, brushing away the slime. The words were incomplete, but a single phrase stood out clear as day. "Leave before." The rest was lost to water and decay, but the message was unmistakable. He sat frozen, the paper limp in his hand, his mind reeling. Whoever had written it had been trying to warn someone, perhaps themselves, perhaps others. Leave before what? Leave before the water rose? Before the tunnels collapsed? Before something worse? Daniel's throat tightened. For the first time, the thrill of discovery faltered beneath a swell of unease. The warning echoed in his head, mingling with the villagers' silence, with the old man's words. People walked away, and they didn't go back. He stared into the lake, the flashlight beam trembling on the dark water. Whatever truth lay beneath its surface, it was not a treasure meant for him. Yet even as his fear grew, he knew he would return again. The warning had come too late. The past had already taken hold of him, and it would not let him go. The words on the sodden scrap of paper stayed with Daniel long after he left the chamber. He returned home that evening with mud on his hands and damp clinging to his clothes, his head pounding with questions. He placed the fragment carefully on the kitchen table, weighting it down with a glass to keep it from curling, and stared at it as if the missing half of the sentence might magically reappear. "Leave before," the phrase echoed in his mind with an unfinished threat, more terrifying for its incompleteness. Leave before what? Before the water rose? Before something collapsed? Or before some secret long buried forced itself into the light? He hardly slept that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he dreamed of the underground hall filling with water, the crates bursting apart as dark waves swallowed him whole. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart hammering, convinced he could still hear the echo of dripping in his ears. By dawn, he had made his decision. He could not abandon the mystery now. Whatever danger had once driven men away from the underground lake had not been enough to erase their traces. He had seen the tools, the beams, the crates. He had touched them, felt the weight of their history. And now the place demanded more from him. The next morning, he prepared with a determination that bordered on obsession. He packed his bag with rope, extra batteries, gloves, and a small crowbar. He filled a flask with water, slipped a notebook into his pocket, and told himself that today he would investigate the chamber as thoroughly as possible. If answers lay hidden in the shadows, he would drag them into the light. As he stepped outside, the air was sharp and cold, the forest damp with the lingering breath of night. The trees loomed closer than before, their branches crowding overhead as if conspiring to block his path, but he ignored the sensation and pressed on until the lake came into view. The stones of the circle waited in silence, their mossy surfaces dark with morning dew. Daniel lowered himself carefully through the opening, his boots finding the familiar grip of the steps, and began the descent. Each footfall echoed more loudly than before, his presence magnified by the stillness of the corridor. The air grew colder as he neared the chamber, and by the time he emerged into the hall, his breath was visible in pale clouds. The lake lay before him unchanged, its surface dark and silent, but now he looked at it with new eyes. It was no longer just a curiosity. It was a vault of secrets, sealed by stone and time, and he was determined to force it open. He moved methodically, his flashlight beam sweeping the walls and floor. He examined the remnants of beams more closely, crouching to run his hands along the rotted wood. The structure had once extended far into the lake, forming a kind of platform or dock. Its collapse suggested either neglect or catastrophe. He imagined workers laboring here, carrying crates along the planks, their boots thudding in rhythm, their lanterns flickering against the stone walls. And then, suddenly, silence. The image of the warning note seared into his mind. Daniel shivered despite himself. At the far side of the chamber, half buried in silt, he found more crates. Their outlines were faint, distorted by decay, but with patience and effort he managed to pry one free. He looped his rope around it, braced his feet against the slick floor, and pulled until the wood shifted. Mud and water oozed from its seams, and with a final heave he dragged it onto the shore. The crate groaned as he pried its lid apart with the crowbar, the damp wood splintering under the strain. Inside he found a heap of rusted tools, hammers, chisels, picks, all corroded nearly beyond recognition. Yet their presence confirmed what he had already suspected. This had been a working site, not a mere storage place. Among the tools lay scraps of fabric, remnants of clothing that disintegrated at his touch. Beneath them, to his astonishment, was another page, protected between layers of cloth. Daniel's hands shook as he lifted it free. The ink was faded but still legible enough to reveal a series of names written in a careful hand. The list contained half a dozen surnames, some familiar from the village, others unfamiliar. His stomach tightened as he traced the letters. These were not anonymous laborers lost to time. They had been men with names, perhaps ancestors of the very people he had spoken to in the store. He folded the page and slipped it into his notebook, then sat back, his mind racing. Why had the villagers not spoken of this? Did they know their history lay buried beneath his land, or had they chosen to forget? He remembered the old man's eyes, the heaviness in his voice, and realized that silence might be its own inheritance. Perhaps the villagers carried this knowledge like a burden, passing it down in fragments, never daring to reveal the full story. Perhaps they had warned him away because they knew what he would find if he kept digging. Daniel stood and aimed his flashlight at the far end of the chamber, where the wall seemed less solid. He approached cautiously, his boots sinking into the damp floor, and discovered another passage branching off from the main hall. It was narrower, partially collapsed, but still navigable. Wooden beams jutted from the walls, their surfaces rotted, their purpose long since lost. He ducked under a sagging support, his breath loud in his ears, and followed the tunnel deeper into the earth. The passage curved sharply, leading him into a smaller chamber where debris was piled high against the walls. Rusted metal rods, broken planks, and the shattered remains of barrels filled the space as if someone had abandoned it in haste. Daniel's heart thudded as he crouched to examine the nearest pile. The barrels were split open, their contents long since leached into the soil, but the faint scent of something chemical lingered. Powder, perhaps. Explosives. He recalled the tools, the beams, the construction of the dock, and it struck him that this place might not have been a simple mine. It might have been something darker, an illicit operation, hidden away from the eyes of law and authority. The thought unsettled him. If this had been a site of secret work, then its abandonment was not simply a matter of accident or collapse. It had been deliberate. The men whose names were on that list had walked away, leaving behind their tools, their crates, even their notes. Something had driven them out, something urgent enough that they had not even taken the time to destroy the evidence. Daniel's gaze lingered on the collapsed barrels, his imagination conjuring images of men hurriedly stacking them, then fleeing into the darkness. The air grew thicker the longer he remained in the smaller chamber. His flashlight flickered again, forcing him to replace the batteries with trembling hands. When the beam steadied, he caught sight of faint markings scratched into the stone wall. They were crude, little more than lines etched with desperate force, but their intent was clear. Someone had been here. Someone who had left a mark in the last moments before departure. Daniel traced the scratches with his fingertips, the cold stone biting into his skin, and felt a wave of unease wash over him. These were not marks of construction or measurement. They were the marks of someone desperate to be remembered, or perhaps to leave a warning. He backed away, his chest tightening. The chamber seemed to close in on him, the debris pressing closer, the air heavier with every breath. He forced himself back into the main hall where the lake waited in silence. Yet, even here, the weight of what he had discovered clung to him. He imagined the names on the list, the scraps of paper, the desperate scratches on the wall, and for the first time the thrill of discovery soured into dread. When he finally ascended the steps and emerged into daylight, the sun seemed too bright, the air too thin. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his body trembling, and realized how profoundly the place had altered him. He had come seeking peace, a new life far from the noise of the city. Instead, he had unearthed a past that reeked of secrecy and fear. And though he told himself he should stop, that he should seal the entrance once and for all, he knew he would not. The underground hall had taken root in his mind, and the deeper he dug, the more it consumed him. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with the names before him, whispering them under his breath as if summoning ghosts. He could not help but wonder if the descendants of those men still lived in the village, if they carried the weight of this history in their silence. He imagined confronting them, demanding answers, but he knew their lips would remain sealed. Whatever had happened beneath the earth, it was not meant to be spoken aloud. And yet Daniel could not let it rest. The lake pulled at him, its dark water like a mirror reflecting his own growing obsession. The warning on the page, the list of names, the scattered tools and collapsed barrels, they were pieces of a puzzle that had begun to consume him. As he lay in bed, the sound of dripping returned to him, louder now, closer, until he felt as though it was seeping into the walls of his home. He pressed a pillow over his ears, but still it came, steady and relentless, echoing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. By the time dawn came, Daniel knew there would be no turning back. Whatever truth lay beneath his land, it had already claimed him. The dangerous investigation had only just begun, and he was powerless to stop himself from continuing. The regret he felt, faint and distant, was drowned by the stronger current of compulsion. He had opened the circle, descended the steps, and found the traces of the past. And now, whether he wished it or not, he was bound to follow them wherever they led. The names on the page had haunted Daniel through the night, lingering in the silence of the house as if the men themselves were whispering in the shadows. He awoke before dawn, his body heavy with exhaustion, yet his mind burning with restless energy. The old clock on the mantel ticked steadily in the darkness, each second a reminder that the past was alive beneath his land, and he had not yet reached the end of it. As he sat at the table, staring at the list of names and the water-stained fragment with its unfinished warning, he felt the same dread that had first seized him at the edge of the underground lake. But beneath the dread was something far stronger, an unbearable pull, a compulsion to return. When the first light of morning crept over the meadow, Daniel packed his bag once more. His hands shook as he checked the batteries, the rope, and the crowbar. He slipped the folded papers into his notebook and told himself that today would be the last time. Today he would go as far as he dared, uncover what he could, and then seal the entrance forever. Yet, even as he spoke the thought aloud, it rang false in his own ears. He knew he was lying to himself. Each time he had promised to stop, each time he had vowed to turn away, and each time the silence of the lake had pulled him back. The path through the forest seemed darker that morning, though the sun was high and bright. The branches arched over him, blocking the light, and the air was damp with a chill that seeped into his bones. When he reached the clearing, the circle of stones waited, solemn and patient, as though it knew he would come. Daniel crouched and pushed his way through the opening, lowering himself onto the stone steps. The cool breath of the underground rose to meet him, sharp and metallic, and with every step downward he felt the weight of the earth pressing closer. The chamber looked the same as before, but Daniel saw it now with a sharpened sense of dread. The lake lay silent. The broken beams stretched toward it like skeletal fingers, and the crates along the shore waited in their slow decay. He turned his flashlight toward the narrower passage he had discovered the day before, the one with the collapsed barrels and the desperate scratches on the wall. The memory of those markings still chilled him, but he could not resist the urge to go deeper. He ducked beneath the sagging beams and entered the tunnel once more. The air here was thicker, almost suffocating, and the smell of damp wood and rust was stronger. His boots squelched in the mud as he advanced, his light catching on the scattered remains of tools and timber. He forced himself past the collapsed barrels, stepping carefully around the debris, and pressed deeper into the passage. It twisted sharply before widening into another chamber, smaller than the hall with the lake but far more unsettling. The walls were scarred with marks, not only the desperate scratches he had seen before, but also deeper gouges, as if someone had hacked at the stone with tools in a frenzy. Daniel's breath quickened. He raised the flashlight higher, and the beam revealed a mound in the corner of the chamber. At first he thought it was more debris, but as he stepped closer he saw the truth. The mound was made of beams and planks stacked haphazardly, covering something beneath. His hands trembled as he pulled at the wood, each piece groaning as it shifted. The smell that escaped was rank, a stagnant stench of rot that had lingered for decades. Daniel gagged, but he forced himself to continue until the shape beneath was revealed. It was a bed frame, rusted and broken, its springs twisted like wire. Around it lay fragments of fabric, torn and stained, and what looked like the remnants of personal belongings: a shattered lantern, a boot without its sole, scraps of paper too faded to read. The realization struck him with brutal force. Someone had lived here. Someone had slept in this chamber, had left behind their meager possessions in haste or desperation, and whoever they were, they had not left by choice. Daniel stumbled back, the flashlight beam shaking wildly across the walls. He could almost hear the breath of the men who had once worked here, could almost see their faces in the shadows. The list of names in his notebook seemed suddenly heavier, more than ink on paper. They were lives, tethered to this place, swallowed by it. He pressed a hand to his forehead, fighting the rising tide of nausea, but the compulsion to understand pushed him forward again. At the far wall of the chamber, he noticed something unusual, a section of stone that looked different from the rest, as though bricks had been fitted together to conceal an opening. His pulse hammered as he approached. The bricks were uneven, and in places the mortar had crumbled away. He pried at them with the crowbar, and slowly, one by one, they gave way, falling with dull thuds onto the floor. Behind them was a small cavity, just large enough for a man to crouch in. Daniel leaned inside, sweeping the light across the interior. At first, it appeared empty, but then he saw the marks on the walls. They were scratches, etched in vertical lines 4 at a time, like tally marks. Dozens of them running in uneven rows across the stone. His throat tightened as he realized what they meant. Someone had been trapped here, marking the passage of time, counting the days, or the attempts to claw their way out. He pressed his hand against the stone, feeling the shallow grooves beneath his fingertips, and the horror of it settled into his bones. This was no place of work. This was a prison. Beneath the tally marks was another message, carved with more force. The letters were jagged, uneven, but legible enough to make his stomach turn. "We cannot leave." The words seemed to vibrate in the silence, as though they had been spoken aloud. Daniel staggered back, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The scratches, the bed frame, the list of names, everything converged into a truth too terrible to ignore. The men who had worked here had not abandoned their tools and crates willingly. They had been driven away, or worse, trapped by something they could not escape. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the air heavy and oppressive. Daniel's skin prickled with cold sweat, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. For the first time, he regretted everything. Uncovering the stone circle, descending the steps, prying into secrets that had been buried for more than a century. He wanted nothing more than to flee, to feel the sunlight on his face again, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. He turned the flashlight toward the narrow passage behind him, desperate for the way out, when he heard it. The faint plop of water. He froze. The sound had always been there in the hall with the lake, but now, in this smaller chamber, it was unmistakable. It echoed from the direction of the tunnel, steady and deliberate, like footsteps pacing through shallow water. His chest tightened as panic surged through him. He stumbled forward, nearly tripping over the broken bed frame, and pushed himself back into the passage. His flashlight beam bounced wildly off the stone, the shadows twisting with each movement, but he did not stop until he reached the main hall. The lake lay before him in silence, its surface unbroken. The broken beams reached toward it, unchanged, and the crates lay where he had left them. Yet Daniel could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the chamber itself was watching him. He backed slowly toward the corridor, his legs trembling, and when he finally set foot on the steps, his entire body sagged with relief. He climbed quickly, gripping the rope with shaking hands until the circle of daylight appeared above. When he emerged into the clearing, he collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. The forest was silent around him, but it no longer brought comfort. The air was too still, the trees too tall, and the lake behind him seemed to brood in its quiet. Daniel pressed his face into his hands, his mind reeling with what he had seen. The tally marks, the words carved into the wall, the possessions left behind. They were fragments of a nightmare that had played out in the darkness long before he arrived. But now he had stepped into it, and it had become his own. He walked slowly back to the house, each step heavier than the last. When he entered the kitchen, the papers still lay on the table, the names staring up at him with silent accusation. He added the new fragment to them, his hands trembling as he smoothed it flat. The message was simple, unadorned, but it carried the weight of despair. "We cannot leave." Daniel stared at it until his vision blurred with tears. The regret he had tried to push aside now swelled in his chest, suffocating him. He had wanted peace, solitude, a place to escape the noise of the city. Instead, he had unearthed a past of misery and entrapment, and in doing so he had bound himself to it. That night, as he lay awake in the dark, he heard the drip of water again. Not in his memory this time, not in his dreams, but in the very walls of his house. It echoed faintly from the corners, steady and patient, like a clock counting down. He pulled the blanket over his head, but the sound remained, and with each drip he felt the weight of the underground pressing closer, as though the lake had followed him home. Daniel woke with the distinct impression that the dripping sound had never ceased through the night. It was as though the walls of his house had absorbed the rhythm of the underground chamber, and even in silence the echo carried on. His eyes were raw with sleeplessness, his body heavy, but the tension in his chest kept him from remaining in bed. He rose before dawn, his movements unsteady, and stood at the window staring out toward the trees. The lake was hidden beyond them, but he could feel its presence as surely as if it lay just outside the door, patient and waiting. He stumbled into the kitchen and sat at the table. The scraps of paper lay where he had left them, weighted down beneath his notebook, their stains spreading like bruises across the surface. The words, scrawled in jagged lines, haunted him. "Leave, before," and "We cannot leave." They stared back at him with an insistence he could no longer ignore, a warning and a curse all at once. For a long time he sat motionless, his hands pressed flat to the table, his mind tangled in regret. He wished he had never touched the stones, never descended those steps, never forced the past to reveal itself. He wished he could return to the day he first stood on the porch, breathing the sharp air of the forest, believing he had found peace. But there was no return now. The truth had bound itself to him, and even if he sealed the entrance, even if he burned the papers, the knowledge would remain. He had uncovered something that demanded to be remembered, and he carried it with him like a shadow. Yet he knew he could not remain here. The weight of it was too much, the silence too heavy, the house too close to the secrets beneath. He would have to leave. The day passed slowly, each hour dragging under the burden of his decision. He walked through the rooms of the house, touching the walls as though saying goodbye, though he had only just begun to make it his home. He thought of the villagers and their quiet warnings, their heavy silence, and for the first time he understood their caution. They had lived in the shadow of this truth for generations, and they had chosen silence as their shield. He had shattered that shield, and now he could not bear to share their burden. By evening, he had packed a suitcase with the essentials. He did not need much: clothes, a few books, his father's clock. He left the papers on the table for a long while, staring at them as though deciding their fate. Finally, he slipped them into the suitcase as well. Whatever this story was, it belonged to him now, and he could not abandon it completely, no matter how much he wanted to. When night fell, he sat by the fire, though its warmth did little to drive away the chill. The ticking of the clock filled the silence, steady and patient, like the drip of water he could still hear in his mind. He thought of the men whose names he had found, of the tally marks carved into the wall, of the bed frame twisted with rust. He thought of the crate half buried in the lake, the glint of metal hidden inside, the beams collapsing into darkness. These images would not leave him. They had become part of him, stitched into his memory with the same permanence as scars. He did not sleep that night. At dawn, he carried his suitcase to the car, his movements slow and heavy. The forest was quiet, the meadow damp with dew, and the air sharp with the promise of another cold day. He paused at the edge of the clearing, staring back at the house. For a moment, he considered abandoning the suitcase, locking the door, and pretending that none of it had happened. But the thought dissolved quickly. The lake was there, just beyond the trees, and no amount of denial could erase it. As he started the car and drove down the narrow road, he felt a strange mixture of relief and despair. Relief that he was leaving, that he would no longer wake to the echo of dripping water in his walls, that he would no longer feel the weight of the earth pressing against him. But despair because he knew that leaving would not free him. The knowledge would follow him wherever he went. The tally marks, the scratches, the desperate words carved into stone. They were etched into his memory, impossible to forget. He thought of selling the property, of passing it on to someone else, but the idea filled him with shame. To lure another soul into this burden, to hand them the keys to a house built over such misery, felt like betrayal. Yet he also knew he could not keep it. His mother would handle the sale, and he would distance himself from the transaction as much as possible. Perhaps the new owner would never discover the stones, would never pry them loose, would never descend those steps. Perhaps the earth would reclaim its secrets once more, burying them beyond reach. But Daniel doubted it. The lake had a way of calling, of drawing eyes to its surface, of whispering through the silence until curiosity overcame fear. Someone else would come. Someone else would open the way. As the car wound along the road, the trees falling away behind him, Daniel caught sight of the lake one last time in the rearview mirror. It lay calm and still, its surface reflecting the pale morning sky, its edges softened by mist. For an instant, it looked almost beautiful, the kind of scene he had once dreamed of when imagining a home in the country. But he knew the truth now. The stillness was not peace. It was silence, deliberate and heavy, the silence of secrets that should never have been uncovered. His chest tightened as he stared into the mirror, his eyes fixed on the shrinking image of the water. He knew he would never forget it, never escape it. The lake would follow him, not in body but in mind, its darkness always lingering at the edge of his thoughts. The price of discovery was not just the loss of his home, but the loss of the peace he had sought. He had traded one kind of noise for another, the clamor of the city for the echo of the underground, and he could never go back to ignorance. When the lake finally disappeared from view, hidden by distance and trees, Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. His eyes burned, though no tears came. He drove on, the suitcase heavy in the back seat, the papers folded within it like coals that refused to cool. He did not look back again. The road stretched ahead, empty and winding, and Daniel pressed forward into it with the hollow certainty that whatever life he built now would always carry the weight of what he had uncovered. He had wanted freedom, but instead he had bound himself to a story older than he could comprehend. The tally marks, the desperate carvings, the words, "We cannot leave," they belonged to the men of the past, but now they belonged to him as well. And though he had left the house, left the clearing, left the circle of stones and the underground lake, Daniel knew with painful clarity that he would never truly leave. He had become another mark in the wall, another name on the list, another soul claimed by the silence beneath the earth. If this story shocked you, just wait until you see what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss our most unbelievable discoveries. Don't stop here. Check out the other videos on our channel right now, each one more jaw-dropping than the last. And if you know someone who loves a mystery as much as you do, share this video with them. They won't believe what happens next.